My name is Rashné Jehangir. We are going to begin today by introducing ourselves. Those are the four of us who are involved in this session, and then cover the agenda as delineated on this particular slide. So I'll just share that my name is Rashné Jehangir. I am an associate professor. My work and research has focused on the experience of first generation working class low income students for the most of my career, and I began my career in federally funded TRIO programs. And I have been lucky to partner with the graduate school as a faculty fellow around this work. Rhiannon?
My name is Rhiannon Williams, and I work in the graduate school as a program facilitator. So main role is to ensure that we're addressing all the needs, or as many needs of the grad students as possible, especially from those that may have different marginalized identities, and do evaluative work around this.
Hi, Dr. Cori Bazemore-James. I go by she, her pronouns. I am the Director of Retention and Success in the Graduate School Diversity Office. Noro? Yep.
I'm Noro Andriamanalina, Director of Academic and Professional Development for the Graduate School. So I oversee the support for all graduate students across colleges.
Thank you. So what I want to do first is just quickly situate how in our work we have defined first generation graduate students and first generation college students. There is a significant variance in the literature around this definition, and I will share briefly a rationale for this particular choice of the definition that we have adopted in our work in this particular context. So we are defining first-gen college student as an individual who is first in their immediate family to complete an undergraduate degree. Some of this definition is rooted in the work of the Pell Institute and federally funded TRIO programs, and really goes back to 1960s war on poverty and the rationale for recognizing impediments to access to college and in turn graduate school. There are graduate programs around the country who might define first-gen college or first-gen graduate students more broadly, but given that most people are first to attend graduate school, we wanted to specify that our attention is on students who are first in their family to go to college and then enter graduate school. What I'll also say is that in light of the previous session, if some of you were at the opening session and the significant body of research on first-gen college students, it's important to recognize that first-gen students are not monolithic, that there are multiple intersecting identities, including race, social class, immigrant status, ability, and a number of other issues that complicate who they are. And the rationale for using this particular moniker is to think about the intersections of those and the way systemic barriers around socialization in graduate school impact both the entry and trajectory of students through the work. Our goal for the session today is to draw a little bit on the CEHD data that highlights the experiences of first gen and working class students and students of color, that sort of intersection, and also to pull some data points from 3 focus groups that we conducted together around first gen graduate student experiences on our campus. Rhiannon, do you want to add a little bit to this here? You want to unmute.
Thank you. I just wanted to add that as a team, we have grappled with and talked and discussed to come up with this definition. However, there is not currently a universal definition at the University of Minnesota, and Cori's going to talk a little bit more about some of the work that the grad school and others are doing to not only maybe come up with a agreed upon definition, but to ensure that students can identify centrally if they choose. So as a part of that, you can go on to the next slide. Part of that work, we have really made an intentional effort at the grad school to start to think about how are we creating a system that enables us to know who may identify as a first generation college student. So one of these efforts, the first is that on each admissions application, students may self-identify if they would choose. However, we realize that some may not feel comfortable doing that at admissions. So we have also created a just short Google form that we sent to all grad students. And so as such, this is the number that we have currently of students who have self-identified as first generation college students with that definition that we just shared. And as you guys can see, I mean, this is just a one picture snapshot of how the demographics are intersecting. And I just want to mention here quickly, because as we're going to go on and talk about low income students, we use the one indicator definition of Pell Grant, meaning students that come from families under the income of 30,000. And as you can see here, I just wanted to briefly that international students obviously are part of the Pell Grant, but that international students also have their own kind of potentially unique experiences, maybe different than we tried in our focus group to recruit and hear from international students. But this is just another area that it tends to not get as focused on. So just in the next section here, we're going to talk briefly about some of the I'm going to briefly highlight some of the emerging themes from the pretty scant literature on first generation college students in graduate school. And, you know, there may be some, obviously there are intersecting themes and experiences from those in undergrad to grad, but there are also some unique ones that are coming out from graduate students. And the first is around the hidden curriculum. Also thinking about imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon, material insecurity, and community alienation and isolation. So we'll go a little bit more in depth. And what I'm going to do is just briefly give you kind of this snapshot, like large overview from the gradSERU. And for those that aren't aware of the gradSERU, it's a survey. It's given every other year to all grad students. And we really encourage grad students to take the time to complete it because it's a way both at the program level and at the institution level that we can understand the broad experiences of grad students here at the university. So, and just to give a little bit of, I didn't put the kind of numbers in here, but just to quickly give you a context, we had about 1,000 first generation students to respond. So that's about 35% of the first generation students that we know of respond to the survey. And I focused on the intersections of first generation and social class, as well as first generation and race and ethnicity. It's, as the presenters pointed out many times in the intro presentations today, it's complex. There's no easy or, and this is just to give kind of this broader picture that students, both, as you can see here, it's not necessarily that they're first generation, but those that come from a poor or low income family or resources that are responding significantly higher than their counterparts at middle class, and it basically kind of is a curve. It goes all the way down, and 28%, 33% of the students. So just to give you a context, there are quite a few more first generation students, about 3 times as many. So it's about 300 who identify as poor and low income, and then non-first generation, it's about 100. So this is just giving a little context into students, what they're saying about their relationship with their advisor. Okay. And this one is just, I pulled this one out to And I would say this kind of touches also on the intersection of hidden curriculum and imposter syndrome. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the next qualitative. But my advisor is interested in collaborating with me on research, strongly disagree or disagree. And as you can see here, this is, it's a significant number of students. And this is, again, the intersection of first generation and race and ethnicity. And so it is, again, complex. It's not just first generation. It's not just race and ethnicity. It's this complex mixture, and there's probably other identities that many of these students may choose or identify with as well. Okay, and I'll turn it over.
One of the things that's interesting about looking at the CEHD data is we know that it doesn't capture, all the experiences of all first-gen students, but a subsection, as Rhiannon mentioned. One of the things historically that has not been done well with first generation data just around the country in general is intersecting it with issues that have been raised, like issues of race and social class. I often think the triangulation of those things says a lot about the way in which we want to and seek to diversify the academy, but perhaps don't collect our data in ways that can attend to that. So part of what we're hoping to do in this presentation is to highlight some components of data from CEHD and then see how that aligned with the narratives that emerge from our focus groups. And the rationale for that is that the data presents a certain dimension of a story, and the focus groups have sought to animate, tease out, or operationalize what might be sitting under that data. And so, for example, this particular quote speaks to the way in which students talked about this process of naming and negotiating hidden curriculum. And I'll read components of it. I often do this thing with qualitative data because I want to prepare myself for the lack of time I have to spend telling every story that I want to tell. I use the quotes and highlight certain parts that I think really speak to the crux of the matter. And here you hear the student talking about somebody who has not been exposed to academics, communicating with people within the academic world and asking themselves questions. Am I actually communicating appropriately? Am I using the right headers? Am I not, being unprofessional because no one ever taught me those things? And so for me, those things are the things I'm navigating on your own, because no one teaches you, hey, if you're going to talk to a professor or whoever it may be, this is how you set it up. There are all these little things that I find challenging. And I do appreciate the types of support we get. And here are the student names, Noro and Cori's work in COSPs and other spaces to get our toes wet. But at the crux of this, and this is a theme that came up in the data, is what are these pieces of hidden curriculum? And students named them in multiple different ways. The language of academia was certainly one of them, and that is both written and verbal language. Etiquette and logistics, what is and are the appropriate etiquettes of the context of a campus, the context of a disciplinary space, and even down to the context of a particular lab space and a particular faculty member. Students also in this arena around negotiating hidden curriculum talked about the processes and milestones that are embedded in the graduate process and how and where they come to know that, and to what extent they may or may not feel comfortable even asking about that because they're questioning the legitimacy of the question itself. Which speaks to this idea of hidden curriculum. Like, when is your prelim? How do you know that you're supposed to do an internship? Who should you explore connecting to do that internship with? Within this theme, there was also significant conversation, because I want to be careful not to perpetuate a deficit narrative around how students sought to self-navigate these processes in ways that they would deem like their own hustle and their own ability to bridge these gaps through community resources, peers, that one person who is their touchstone or mentor. So that came up quite a bit in the bodies of data. And I'm going to ask somebody else in my team to monitor the chat, since I cannot drive and chew gum right now at the same time. So I'm going to move on to a second quote here. And what I'd like to do is just have you as our audience reflect on the quote. And if you'd share back with us either verbally, because you should be able to unmute yourself, or in the chat, what you're hearing in this quote. So I'll just give you a few minutes to just take a look at that quote. Then I welcome your comments. So the question I'm asking you is sort of, what do you see? How do you know, right? What do you see? What do you see as the issues that the student is raising?
Good morning. I think when I read this quote, the first thing that pops up to me is just imposter syndrome, that the student is naming like all of the marginalized identities or reasons like why they should not be in the space that they are instead of they are in the space that they are. And so I think that's something that kind of that game that we play as we're like, we're not supposed to be here, but I'm here. So that means I probably shouldn't actually be here. So let me tell you why I shouldn't be here and why I don't belong. So I would say that's what's sticking out for me when I read this quote.
Thanks, Kinsey. This sort of the working that one must do to legitimize one's presence in a certain space is some of what I'm hearing you talk about. Any other comments that people would like to share?
Morning. I'm seeing a class of cultures here. So culture of being in a lab, culture of working at a restaurant, and that's apparent in the student not knowing how to behave. Oh, they say culture too.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. The way in which essentially the worlds are colliding and the language, the criteria, what's valued in those different spaces are also colliding, and the student is trying to negotiate all those things at once. There's a second quote here that sort of builds on that, and I'll read it briefly. Here the student says, I don't always share the identity when I'm in like professional spaces, like talking to colleagues or other faculty. I'm a grad assistant, and with teaching and instructors, I'm with other first-gen students, and I will share that piece there because I think it's important for other younger students to see faculty and grad students who are also first-gen. But at the bottom, she says, so openly disclosing that sometimes feels like it causes me a bit more grief. So let me ask you, what your comments are, reactions are to this particular quote.
Rashné, I can pop in on this one.
Yeah,
the line that really hit me is what kind of towards the bottom where this person says, like, I know statistically I'm not supposed to be here as a PhD student. That has, like, I'm a first-gen student too, so that's become more and more salient as I've advanced up the academic ladder here. But I do disclose that more often to my students that I teach more often than if I'm in, faculty meetings or meetings with other colleagues, especially folks who are older and more established. But especially if I have students share that with me, which has happened a couple times, then I absolutely will share that back so they know that someone else is, that they're not the only one. Because especially in the class that I teach, we don't talk a lot about that particular piece of identity. And so if someone shares that with me, I really make sure to share that and reciprocate that with them. But yeah, that line about statistically not being or not supposed to be here as a PhD student really, that hits home in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I hear the emotion in your voice as you talk about that. I see some language coming in the chat. Colleen notes that I had a professor in grad school who identified herself as working class, and it changed my whole world. So some of this speaks to the necessity and importance of making the invisible visible because of the nature of first-gen identity and working class identity in many ways. So I'll just say a little bit about those two quotes, and then we can move on to some other data. So one of the themes that emerged both in this data set and 30 other interviews I did with first-gen grad students across our campus is the way in which students talked about this sort of chameleon-like existence of becoming invisible and visible depending on the context and depending on the level of trust and what they perceived as potential judgment of their identities. And Morgan, I heard you sort of allude to that with the point that you made with depending on whom I'm with and with certain established faculty, I might not share that. So students talked about this in the way in which they found status quo socialization manifested. So how has that hidden curriculum become operationalized and animated in their day-to-day lives and their experiences in their programs and with their faculty members and peers? So one issue was sort of a very individualistic productivity mentality relative to collaborative or community-based values that may be more reflective of their community in spaces that they had come from before. This idea that there is a way and one way to do it and what the culture of that program might be, and the way in which there were often, they felt nods to acknowledgement of diversity in all its forms without enactments attached to it. Many students talked about this sort of caution about sharing first-gen identity. And for students of color who were first-gen, many commented on while there were spaces to talk about being a Black engineer, talking about being a poor Black engineer was not something that was invited in the academy and not something that they were going to address because they felt like that attached a certain judgment to either their intellectual prowess, their ability to negotiate complex systems and so on and so forth. So the way in which the first-gen identity attributed a deficit to them, even though they may have brought with them significant capital negotiating the academy to arrive at a PhD program or a master's program, that became sort of a cautionary tale for many of the students in this data set. Rhiannon, you're going to talk a little bit more about this with regard to community and isolation.
These are just several pieces out of the construct around sense of belonging that I thought were just spoke to kind of the broader feelings or broader snapshot of how students are thinking about how they belong within their program. And so these ones, 20% or more strongly disagreed who were poor or low income. And, faculty respecting students regardless of their background. Faculty encouraging expressions of diverse viewpoints from their students. So not feeling like they could express, like you just mentioned about maybe a piece of their identity, right? What pieces are acceptable and what are not. There are open lines of communication between students and faculty regarding their needs, concerns. So if they don't feel right now that they can even talk about it, right? Or that there's a space to communicate what their needs might be. And just the last one, overall, the environment or climate is positive and welcoming. So, just to reiterate, we're talking about, at least 200 or 300 students. So that's, sometimes people can discount 20%, but that's still, we're talking about a lot of students here. And the next piece, this is one thing that really emerged across both race and ethnicity as a huge concern for students. And I go back to kind of think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so if you don't feel secure in where you're going to get your next meal, literally where you're going to live, where you're going to be able to, get funding from, and then it's very difficult to engage in other activities in terms of your roles as a grad student. And as you can see here, 36 and 29% were concerned about paying for their education the next year. And I showed you can see how it just, and this is like the pattern for most responses for any question on the gradSERU in terms of poor, low income, identifying to upper middle class. So. And then in terms of race and ethnicity, again, this came out quite strong in terms of crossed with, how one identified. And over the course of the last academic year, how stressful has each of the following going? And I just want to note, I would love to look at race, ethnicity, and social class and first generation status but because of numbers within each of those categories, we're not able to, because we're afraid of, obviously, just don't want to in any way risk the students' anonymity. So, but you can kind of think about, right? You know, obviously within each of these, there's, you know, probably a lot of the respondents based on the last one may come from a poor or low income family.
Yeah. Yeah, I often try to envisage this as a Venn diagram and then think about where these overlaps occur in the data sets. And one of the things I think it's important to think about is we can't cover all the themes that were raised, but this issue of material security, how that translated into mental health concerns, how that translated into roles that they played with their family as well. Students often talked about that jarring juxtaposition of still feeling like they needed to contribute to their family and familial income in different ways. So taking on more than one job in many cases. But what I wanted to note also is the way in which some of what emerged, depending on the types of sources of support that students were able to find. So in some cases, like Colleen mentioned, if there was a faculty member who recognized and named their own first-gen identity or social class, the avenues that created for support and to make things visible. And there were certainly a few programs where students talked about their faculty doing that, and how that empowered them to sort of envisage their own voice and validate their own voice in their meaning making. And this student talks about this idea of being told how their writing was informal and how they sought to rebel against that and said, I find myself kind of pushing back and trying to make people purposely feel uncomfortable. And there's certain clues to me about how a person feels about this stuff. And this is a small one. But when I hear somebody say, you know, that person doesn't know the difference between there and there, then their opinion doesn't matter. That's my entire family. So this quote, again, demonstrates the way in which, when given the opportunity and space to reflect on one's first-gen identity and familial capital, students are able to, and often wanting to and hungry to step into that space. But where and when that opportunity might arise is often by happenstance. And some of it is because we don't think about socialization as different than when we were socialized into the academy. And there are, you know, a lot of work on socialization models, and I'm going to touch on them very briefly, but one of the types of socialization models that have driven graduate education for a long time is, of course, the faculty-peer connections, this notion of you come here, you gain these skills in particular enclaves and particular spaces for dissemination, and you become integrated into this professional space. Now, obviously, there's a lot of merit to that idea. People need to learn how to negotiate the language and the space of their disciplines to succeed in them. But one of the questions this raises is that the current models tend to articulate a very linear path. And if you go back to the narrative of the waitress that I talked about earlier, that isn't the path of all our students. And so we've got a little bit of a two trains running situation where we want to diversify the academy, but the manners in which we seek to engage students in that process of socialization to the space are reflective of students from a different era. And so there's a mismatch in that way. And models that emphasize the power of the institution acculturating graduate students without attending to the student, as Dean Rodriguez commented on this morning. Are we student ready is a question that is being raised, certainly in undergrad realms, and it's time that it enters the graduate realm as well. So some of the ways in which expanding graduate socialization models are at play is how are students getting support in worlds outside of their discipline, creating worlds within a world, and thinking about how advisors play such a critical role in their trajectory. So I want to then pass it on to Noro, or I think it's going to be Cori, right, to talk a little bit about how some of these efforts are translating into initiatives in the graduate school.
Yeah, so first it translated into the Community of Scholars Program, or COSP, which COSP is a program for all domestic BIPOC graduate students in research-based programs at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities and Duluth. which is a population of about 2,300 students, which is a large community. It's still, you know, it's making a smaller community of BIPOC grad students, but it's still pretty large. And so what I was hearing as I was rolling into this role was that there's also a need for smaller identity-based communities. So in 2019, we initiated identity-based communities, so specific groups like first-gen grads. And we started doing annual get-together event. We created a listserv for each of those groups. Here's first-gen grads, QT POC grads, Native grads, Latinx grads. We have 8 different identity-based groups that were identified. And so for the annual activities for first-gen grads, we did, the first one was in person. We had Dr. Mylene Colbreth from the Grad School Diversity Office join us and give a not a presentation, but a discussion circle, really called Rookie Moves. If I knew them, I know now, where she had piles of cards based on categories and different categories that first-gen grad students may be curious about or haven't heard about and want to discuss. And each of the students would take turns picking a card and leading to a great discussion about all these different topics. And there's so much more to discuss than we had time to, so it was really a great event. And the next event we did this year, which you see pictures of, we had an online paint night with a guest artist who is also first gen and a person of color in higher ed, who led us through the painting you see behind me, where we did the skyline of Minneapolis. But while being together in community, doing this fun event, we were having conversation about how are you experiencing life as a first gen grad student? What's going on for you? And just having that community space to discuss. So while it has been really a positive space for CUSP grad students, we also have since identified there's still a gap in service for first gen students who are not CUSP scholars, who are not domestic BIPOC graduate students. And we felt that there is an importance to have space for both, not to say, well, let's open up the CUSP space for all students, because there still needs to be a sacred, safe space for BIPOC graduate students. So we talked about how do we also serve both groups of students, and not to say that BIPOC students should be in one and not the other, but how do we serve all students in a value add sort of way? And I'll pass to Nuru for the next slide.
Thank you, Cori. Good morning, everyone. Oh, in fall of 2019, Dean Scott Lanyon of the graduate school and I talked about how do we create space and community for all graduate students, masters, and PhDs who identify as first generation college students in graduate programs. And we partnered with Rashné, because of the research that she's already doing around first gen, to help us think through what we could do for graduate students. And the way I approach my work is not necessarily developing more resources or subscribing to more online resources from vendors, but targeting the resources that we have to specific communities where there is a gap. So where do we need to make sure that we develop resources to meet students where they are and in communities that they're in. So we're looking at all of the online and when we are back face to face, how we could support students in different communities. So we partnered with Rashné and Graduate School Diversity Office to develop what's called First Gen Connect. And so that's what we are calling this community, this initiative to connect all graduate students who are first generation college students. And we have a listserv, First Gen Connect listserv. And from the focus groups that we conducted in the fall, the 3 focus groups, we discovered that it would be good to bring students together this spring and have an opportunity for them to interact with one another. So on April 14th and 16th, we will have students engage with each other to just get to know one another, share about their experiences as first-gen students, and also to share with us some pressing topics and resources that they need as we prepare for the 21-22 academic year. So basically, what do you need to sort of navigate through for the next year to be successful? And also for them to inform us why they would like to connect with one another and how. So in terms of the platform, what kind of technological tools are they already using that they'd like to apply with one another through the First Gen Connect. And the idea is to really have the students provide us input on next steps, how they want to connect with one another, what we can do better in the graduate school to support them. So we have about 724 students who showed interest in being part of the First Gen Connect. And I looked at the numbers later, we'll probably have close to 120 or so interested in attending either the April 14th or the 16th event. So we're excited that we have launched this initiative, and we're looking forward to getting student input on how we can best support them. But the idea is to really target the resources that we currently have. The graduate school subscribes to quite a number of online support resources, but we want to know how to make sure we get the most from those resources to support first gen college students in graduate programs. Thank you.
And part of our work of figuring out how to best serve first-gen grad students, naturally the question came up of, well, how do we know who they are? How do we find them? And this has been, of course, a difficult task for us, for a lot of people in the university and many universities, because it's not a common question that we have students answer. It's not a required question that they have to answer somewhere or update or anything like that. So we were, as this group here, trying to decide how best do we find those students. And we thought, well, maybe we would just ask to add the question to MyU. You know, in MyU, you can update your ethnicity, you can update a few different identity pieces of information about yourself. And so we thought maybe it'd be as simple as adding that question, which led down through a rabbit hole of realizing, well, it's a much bigger process than just adding a question. So now what we're doing is we have this working group of folks who are working on first defining for the University of Minnesota, who do we mean when we say first gen students, whether grad students, undergrad students, who are first gen? And we need to have a common definition so that we're all asking the same question and talking about the same subset of students. It's helpful for all of us to know how many students we have to support and in broadening our awareness and support for first gen students. And this is actually something that Rashné had been working on for a long time of figuring out a university-wide definition of first gen, but luckily at this time, for whatever reason, we now have some momentum moving in that direction, thankfully. So questions that we're grappling with, that everyone grapples with, who do we mean, who counts as first gen? Do we mean first in their entire family, first in their immediate family, first to achieve a 4-year degree versus other types of degrees, first to achieve a 4-year degree in the US versus other countries? And we have to make sure that we're asking the same question that admissions is asking, our undergraduate admissions. So the one place where this information is being asked is on the admissions application, not both the undergrad and the grad level. And so we had to look at how are those questions being asked? And when we look at the grad level, what you see here is actually an update, what we're planning to change it to, but what it has been for the last few years is simply, are you a first generation college student? And there was no definition given on what that meant. And it was only asked of domestic graduate students. It wasn't asked of international graduate students. It had only been being asked for the last couple of years. So the information is not going to be accurate anyway, but this doesn't help it to be accurate by having asking less students and not giving a definition. So this group here, the four of us had decided on a definition for next year's application, saying students for whom parents and guardian did not graduate with an undergraduate degree. And then in this working group, we discovered the undergrad version of how they define it in their application, which is no parent or guardian had received a 4-year undergraduate degree from a college or university. So while they look essentially like the same definition, they're not exactly the same. So it's really important that we continue this work of this new working group of coming up with the common definition and making it really clear who we're talking about, who we're asking, how we're asking, and where we can provide other places to ask, because on the application to admission, those are students who are not actually our students yet, and those are optional questions. So it's not likely that we'll get all of the data that we're hoping for. So where else and how often do we ask for updates on that information?
And Cori, did you want to say a little bit more, Rhiannon, around how we shifted some of the language to so that students who were international applicants could also be recognized for their first-gen status on the admissions application? I know we worked on some language around that, and I know Lisa had a question about that.
You know, I know that we were going back and forth about whether, you know, the certain country context, even where their parents had completed a 4-year undergraduate degree, whether or not they would have some similar experiences to students domestically that had not, their parents hadn't completed. But we didn't come to any conclusion. We just brought that up as something to think about. So as I think what we came to was just leaving it all the same, because it got too complicated to have 2 separate ones. But knowing where the student grew up, we could cross that. So for example, you know, knowing that a student may have grown up in Kenya or in versus maybe having grown up in the UK. So if is that an accurate summary?
Cori, did you want to add anything to that?
I was going to actually rely on Nuru to answer that one.
Yeah, I think we're still working on that because at some point we talked about just saying any student who whose parents or guardians did not complete an undergraduate degree, period, in any country. Mm-hmm. It's hard to kind of say which countries have similar academic systems to the United States. Who's going to make that decision? In some countries, English is their primary language of instruction, and so would one say, would you use that as a criterion? So I think we just need to continue to think about that and decide what is it that we're really trying to address with that question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting because in the, you know, there's significant research in the international community, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, the UK, and on around first-gen students, and the term they use is first in family. That's the they use. So thinking about how do we signal to international students to name an identity that they perhaps are already aware of versus what it means to use new language. But you know, Lisa, I really appreciated your question. And if you had other comments on that that could inform us, we invite your feedback as we're grappling with this, because it's a really important piece of this. Without having definitions, you don't have data. Without having data, you don't know who it is you're serving, and so on and so on. And so this is a really important starting point for this work. So we invite responses to this or any other questions or comments that you might have around the work today that we have presented to you.
Thank you so much for answering my question. And just to give some context, I was born in California, but my parents were born in the Philippines and my dad completed a bachelor's degree there. So that's where the conflict is for me, whether I'm first gen enough or not.
Yeah. And I really hear you when you say, am I first gen enough? Because in doing research around the country at this, for example, I gave a talk at UCLA and they said, are you first gen? And I said, no, my parents had degrees in India. And they said, oh, on our campus, you'd be considered first gen. So it raises these issues about what does that mean? And for me, it was like, well, what does that mean relative to social class? What does it mean that I was able to come to this country as an international student? And all these other complexities that are embedded in this. So I appreciate you raising the question. The other thing I just want to note from our audience is that there are folks here who represent the professional schools, the medical school, pharmacy and other spaces. And that I also want to recognize that those are spaces, the nursing school, and even law schools around the country that are increasingly paying attention to first-gen identity of their students. And so I just wanted to make note of that because it's an important part of this as well. We have about 4 minutes left, so we certainly welcome any other questions or feedback you might have for us as a group as we try to move this work forward on our campus.
Hi everyone, my name is Chanel. I just want to kind of thank you all for the work that you're doing. I feel like as a whole, graduate students are often looked at with this lens of you got it, you already went through the undergrad process, you got it figured out now. Just keep on pushing, get your degree and kind of get out the door as fast as you can. Make sure to do the research while you're here though. And I feel like the conversation is often missing as to what and how our identities affect our experiences, or oftentimes even perhaps the imposter syndrome becomes too much and we choose to either take our talents elsewhere, not continue programs. So I just want to acknowledge the work and just note that I appreciate the work that is happening.
Thank you, Chanel, and other people who have reinforced that in the chat. There was one question about how can I get involved? And I wanted to give Noro and Cori and Rhiannon an opportunity to comment on that as well.
Yeah, so if you're interested in being involved or if you know of other graduate students who would like to be part of First Gen Connect, we can absolutely send a link to the survey, the Google form to join so that you can receive information and be part of the First Gen Connect listserv. So just email me and I'll make sure that you get that.
Great. In the couple minutes I have remaining, I just also want to acknowledge that grad schools and programmatic initiatives from grad schools can do a lot to move things forward, but a great responsibility rests with faculty. And so one of the slides that Rhiannon had shared early on was around advising relationships and the impact that has on the trajectory of students in PhD programs in particular, also master's programs, but in particular, the longevity of that relationship in PhD programs and what that means. And I noted, that there's a presence of faculty today at this session, but also at the conference as a whole. And if there are faculty who want to engage and participate around this topic, I would welcome being connected and thinking about how we might move that work forward in our various spaces and like employing the privilege of the voice that we have to shift socialization in graduate school because I think it's such an important part of this work going forward. About a minute left. So again, we're happy to take feedback or comments. We can certainly put our emails in here if folks want to reach out to us individually or get on any particular list. But we thank you for being here today and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference today. Please do the evaluation. We would love your feedback. Thank you.